Kurt Cobain was 3 songs into the set at a venue in Portland when security grabbed a kid in the front row and started dragging him toward the exit. And what Kurt did in the 7 seconds that followed is a story that begins with a shove and ends somewhere nobody in that room expected. The show stopped at 9:47 on a Saturday night in February 1992 at the Roseland Theater, capacity 1,400, sold out 3 weeks in advance with another 600 people turned away at the door. The band wasn't supposed to be there. The Portland show had been added last minute after a cancellation in Sacramento left a 2-day gap in the tour schedule, and the promoter in Oregon had called, saying he could fill a room if they wanted it. Kurt had said yes because Portland felt like home, in a way Seattle never quite did. Fewer people who thought they knew him. There were more people who just wanted to hear the songs. They opened with Breed, fast, loud, the kind of song that turns a room into a single organism within the first 30 seconds. The crowd was moving the way crowds move when the music is doing what it's supposed to do, which is to say they weren't thinking about moving at all. Kurt was in the space he got to sometimes when everything else disappeared, and there was only the sound and the people receiving it. They went straight into school without breaking, then into Drain You, and it was during the bridge of Drain You that the thing happened that changed the trajectory of the evening. A kid in the front row, 17 or 18 years old, flannel shirt, bleached hair, had climbed onto the barricade separating the crowd from the stage. Not unusual. Happens at every show. Security's job is to get them down before they jump, which is what the security guard did, grabbing the kid by the arm and pulling him backward off the barricade. What happened next was where it stopped being routine. The guard didn't just pull the kid down. He yanked him hard enough that the kid's head snapped back and his body hit the floor in a way that looked wrong, even from the stage. Then the guard grabbed him by the collar and started dragging him toward the exit while the kid was still trying to figure out which way was up. Kurt saw it. He was mid-verse when he saw it. He stopped singing. The rest of the band kept playing for about 4 seconds before they realized Kurt wasn't with them anymore. And the music died in that particular way music dies when something has interrupted it from outside. The room went quiet. 1,400 people trying to figure out what just happened. Kurt was standing at the microphone with his guitar hanging from his shoulder, looking at the security guard who was still dragging the kid toward the exit. The guard hadn't noticed yet that the show had stopped. He was doing his job the way he'd done it 100 times before, without awareness that anyone was paying attention beyond the immediate radius of the situation he was handling. Kurt set his guitar down, not carefully. He just let it drop, and the feedback from the amp filled the room for a second before someone killed the power. He walked to the edge of the stage and said into the microphone in a voice that was quiet but carried to every corner of the room, "Let him go." The security guard stopped. He looked up at the stage. He was holding the kid by the collar with one hand and the kid's arm with the other, and the kid was still mostly limp from hitting the floor. The guard's face had the expression of someone who has just realized they're being observed doing something they thought was private. "Let him go," Kurt said again. Same tone, no anger in it yet, just instruction. The guard said something that the microphone didn't pick up. Kurt jumped off the stage, not walked to the stairs, jumped, 6 feet down to the floor and landed in a crouch and stood up and walked toward the security guard who was still holding the kid. Chris Novoselic said later that he'd never seen Kurt move that fast or with that kind of intention. Dave Grohl said he thought for a second Kurt was going to hit the guy, but Kurt didn't hit him. He stopped about 3 feet away and said something that only the people close enough to hear it heard, and whatever he said made the security guard let go of the kid immediately. The kid dropped to the floor. Kurt knelt down next to him. The room was still completely silent. 1,400 people watching Kurt Cobain kneel on the floor of the Roseland Theater next to a kid who looked half-conscious while the security guard stood there with his hands at his sides, not knowing what to do with them. Kurt said something to the kid that nobody else heard. The kid nodded. Kurt helped him sit up. There was blood coming from the kid's nose, and his eyes weren't quite focused, but he was conscious, and Kurt stayed next to him until he was sure the kid could sit upright on his own. Then Kurt stood up and looked at the security guard. He didn't say anything. He just looked at him for a long moment in a way that made the guard take a step backward. Then Kurt turned and walked back toward the stage and stopped halfway there and turned around and said into the room, not into a microphone this time, just into the air, "Is he okay? Someone tell me if he's okay." 3 or 4 people near the kid said yes. Someone handed the kid a towel, someone else brought him water. Kurt watched until he was satisfied that people were taking care of it. Then he climbed back onto the stage and picked up his guitar and adjusted the strap and looked at Chris and Dave and said something they couldn't hear over the feedback that was still coming from the amp. Chris killed his bass. Dave stopped adjusting his kit. The room went quiet again. And Kurt stood at the microphone and looked out at the crowd and said, "We're not doing this if that's how it's going to be." Nobody knew what he meant yet. Kurt turned and looked at the wings where the venue manager and the head of security were standing. "Your guy just assaulted a kid for climbing on a barricade," Kurt said. "If he's still in this building in 2 minutes, we're leaving." The venue manager said something. Kurt cut him off. "I don't care. 2 minutes. He goes or we go." The head of security started to argue. Kurt set his guitar down again and started walking toward the edge of the stage. The security chief held up his hands. He turned to the guard who'd dragged the kid and said something. The guard left through the side exit. Kurt waited until the door closed behind him. Then he walked back to the microphone. He stood there for a moment looking at the floor, and then he looked up at the crowd and said, "I'm sorry you had to see that." The crowd started clapping, not cheering. Clapping. The kind of applause that happens when people are processing something and don't know what else to do with their hands. Kurt let it go for a few seconds, and then he held up his hand, and the room went quiet again. "That kid didn't do anything wrong," Kurt said. "He was just trying to get closer to the music. That's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to feel it, and nobody gets to hurt you for feeling it." Someone in the crowd shouted something supportive. Kurt didn't acknowledge it. He was looking at the kid who was sitting against the barricade now with the towel pressed to his nose and people around him making sure he was okay. Is there a medic here?" Kurt asked. "Someone who actually knows what they're doing, not just venue staff." A woman near the back raised her hand. Kurt pointed at her. "Can you check on him? Make sure he doesn't have a concussion or something?" The woman made her way through the crowd. Kurt waited. The room waited with him. Nobody was talking. Nobody was moving. 1,400 people standing in complete silence while a woman who happened to be a nurse checked on a kid who'd been dragged across the floor by security. It took about 3 minutes. The woman looked up at Kurt and gave him a thumbs up. The kid was okay. Bruised, probably going to have a black eye, but okay. Kurt nodded. He looked at the kid and said, "You want to stay for the show or you want to go home?" The kid said something. Kurt leaned forward. "Say it louder." "I want to stay," the kid said. His voice carried just far enough for the people near him to hear, and they repeated it louder, and it spread through the room. "I want to stay." Kurt smiled. It was the first time he'd smiled since the music stopped. "Okay," he said. "Then let's make sure you can see." He turned to Chris. "Help me out here." Chris set his bass down and jumped off the stage. Together, they helped the kid to his feet and walked him to the side of the stage where there was a clear sight line and no barricade and no security guards who might have opinions about where he should be standing. Kurt said something to the kid that made him laugh. Then Kurt climbed back on stage and picked up his guitar and looked at Dave and said, "From the top?" Dave counted them in. They started Drain You again from the beginning. But something had changed in the room. The energy was different. Not better or worse, just different, more focused, more intentional, like everyone in that space had just been reminded why they were there. They played for another 90 minutes. Kurt introduced every song with more words than usual. Between Lithium and Come As You Are, he talked about why the songs mattered, about what it meant to feel safe in a room full of strangers, about the difference between security that protects people and security that hurts them. He wasn't preaching. He was just talking. The way you talk when you've decided something is worth saying out loud and you're not worried about whether people want to hear it. Some of the crowd listened closely. Some of them just waited for the next song. Kurt didn't seem to care either way. After the show, Kurt asked the venue manager to bring the kid backstage. The kid came back with the woman who'd checked on him and a friend who'd been standing next to him when it happened. They sat in the dressing room for 20 minutes. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and the particular kind of sweat that comes from playing under stage lights for 90 minutes. Kurt asked the kid his name. Danny asked him where he was from. Gresham, about 20 minutes outside Portland, asked him if he was really okay, not the polite version of the question, but the real one, the one that required a real answer. Danny said yes, but his hands were shaking when he said it, the adrenaline still working its way out of his system. Kurt noticed the shaking. He didn't say anything about it. Then he just handed Danny a bottle of water from the cooler and waited until the kid drank some of it before he kept talking. Kurt gave him the set list from the show, signed it. Then he signed Danny's flannel shirt, the one that had gotten torn when the security guard grabbed him. He wrote on the back of the shirt in silver Sharpie, carefully, taking his time with each letter. Nobody gets to hurt you for feeling it. Danny asked if he could take a photo. Kurt said yes, but only if the woman who had helped him was in it too. They took the photo. The woman's name was Linda. She was a nurse at a clinic in Beaverton, and she'd come to the show with her daughter, who was somewhere out in the crowd waiting for her. Kurt thanked her, told her what she did mattered more than what he did. Linda said that wasn't true, and Kurt said it was, and they went back and forth about it for a minute in the way people do when they're both trying to give the other person credit and neither of them wants to take it. The promoter came in after they left. He wanted to talk about the security situation. Kurt said he didn't want to talk about it. He wanted it fixed. The promoter said the guard had been fired. Kurt said that wasn't enough. The promoter asked what would be enough. Kurt thought about it. Training, he said. Real training. Not just how to remove people, but how to not hurt them while you're doing it. De-escalation, understanding that the kids in that room aren't the enemy, they're the reason we're all here. And if your staff can't do that, don't hire them. The promoter said he'd look into it. Kurt said if he didn't, Nirvana wouldn't play Portland again. And the promoter said he understood. Kurt believed him about half as much as he wanted to. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at Gold Mountain Entertainment, the management company that handled Nirvana's business. Inside was a handwritten note, 2 pages, specific and detailed, from the head of security at the Roseland Theater. It outlined new training protocols for all venue staff, a revised code of conduct for crowd management, and a commitment to bringing in a consultant who specialized in de-escalation techniques. At the bottom of the letter, a single line. You were right. We should have known better. Kurt read the letter once standing in the office where his manager handed it to him. Then he folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. He never responded to it, but he kept it. It was found years later in a box of personal papers at the house in Seattle, still folded, still in the pocket of the jacket he'd been wearing that day. The photograph of Kurt with Danny and Linda from that night became one of the more circulated images among Nirvana fans, not because of anything dramatic in the composition, but because of what it represented. Kurt looked tired in the photo. Danny looked like he'd been through something. Linda looked like someone who was still figuring out why she was in this picture. But there was something in the image that people responded to, a quality of realness that was harder to find in the official photos and press shots. This was what happened when the performance stopped and the person underneath it had to make a decision about what mattered more. And Danny kept the set list and the signed shirt. He framed both of them. They hung in his apartment in Portland for 6 years until he moved to Seattle for work and took them with him. He still has them. The shirt is faded now, the silver Sharpie barely visible unless you know where to look, but the words are still there. Nobody gets to hurt you for feeling it. Linda went back to work at the clinic in Beaverton. She told the story occasionally when it came up naturally, which wasn't often, and she never led with the fact that it was Kurt Cobain. She led with the fact that someone with a platform had used it to make sure a kid was safe, and that mattered more than who that someone was. The video footage of the incident, shot by someone in the crowd on a camcorder that was probably not supposed to be there, Ultimatum has been uploaded and taken down and re-uploaded dozens of times over the years. It's grainy, the audio is distorted, you can barely make out what Kurt is saying when he jumps off the stage, but the sequence of events is clear enough. People who study that footage, and there are people who study it, point to the moment after Kurt helps Danny sit up and before he walks back to the stage, when he just stands there for a second looking at the security guard without saying anything. That moment, they say, is the whole thing. Not the jump, not the confrontation, but the look. The decision happening in real time about what kind of person you're going to be when nobody's telling you what to do. The security protocols that were described in that letter were actually implemented. Not immediately and not perfectly, but they happened. Bert the consultant came in, the training took place. Quarterly reviews became part of the standard operating procedure. Other venues in Portland heard about it. A club in Seattle called asking for the consultant's contact information. A venue in San Francisco rewrote their security manual using the Roseland's new protocols as a template. The Roseland Theater still operates. The security protocols that were put in place after that night are still in use, updated and revised over the years, but built on the same foundation. The current head of security wasn't working there in 1992, but he knows the story. Everyone who works there knows the story. It's part of the training now. Not the version with Kurt Cobain's name in it, but the version that's about what happens when you forget that the people in the room are people first and crowd to be managed second. The story in their telling doesn't need the famous name. It begins with a kid getting hurt and ends with a decision to do better, and everything in between is just someone who saw something wrong and chose not to look away. If this story reminds you that paying attention to the person being hurt is sometimes the most important thing any of us can do, subscribe, leave a comment, and hit that notification bell. More stories about who these artists really were away from the stage and the spotlight are coming every single week.